So I hope you still have some energy left for this. This is going to be a good segue to the next session after the break on mental well-being, because while we're going to be talking about education, this is actually children's emotional engagement with their remote schooling. So two things about this that I have to say now. It's a collaborative effort with the children's school study, and I'll put the link into the chat at the end. I won't do it right now. And it's also a collaborative effort with Julia and Susan from the ICWBN management team. And then, of course, Jenny Simons. She is both part of the ICWBN management team and the Children's School Life Study. So without further ado, we all know about the background of this, but you may not know, if you're not from the Republic of Ireland, that Ireland actually went through one of the harshest lockdowns, at least in Europe, in early 2020, and it in fact had one of the longest school closures, because on March 12th schools were open. On March 13th it was announced that they would all close, and they did indeed all close until the end of the school year. Now, for primary schools, the end of the school year is the end of June. So basically April, May, June, they were all closed. So we're talking about 3.5 months of school closures. This was an incredibly abrupt transition to remote or online schooling for children, their parents, and of course, teachers and school leaders. Now, you may remember that at the start of the pandemic, a whole number of think pieces, opinion pieces were coming out in all kinds of credible publications, including The Lancet, saying that there will be loss of learning for sure, and that it would be unequal. Why? Well, we have this huge literature on socioeconomic inequalities in education and in learning. We also know quite a bit about what happens during summers, just regular summer breaks, and that quite often when children come back from their summer break, those who are from more disadvantaged backgrounds have forgotten some of what they've learned before, and then it takes some time for them to catch up. We also know that when you move to online learning, you have to have good digital resources, you have to have a good place to study, and you need some support from your parents and your family. And so based on that, all of the predictions were quite dire. And only now we're actually starting to get evidence of that. So we have data coming out from countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and also the United Kingdom that uses actual test scores. So not just time spent on studying, but test scores from before and after the pandemic. And we do actually know that there is learning loss. There are still a lot of unanswered questions, but there is either stalled progress or some learning loss in both primary and secondary school children. We have a lot more evidence on learning time, including what we have seen from the previous two presentations, and there is also evidence from other countries. And all of that is pointing to widening socioeconomic inequalities in the amount of time that children devote to their learning during this current period of the pandemic. So this particular paper is not about learning time. We do not have access to that data. This paper is about children's emotional engagement in remote schooling during the first lockdown in Ireland. I'll tell you more about the data, the sample, and how the measures were constructed. But we expect to see some socioeconomic differences in engagement in remote schooling. We also expect to see that those who have better resources for remote learning, and I'll tell you how we define that, will have great engagement with their remote schooling. And also those who were already in some way less disengaged with schooling before the pandemic would also exhibit higher levels of engagement during this very abrupt transition to remote learning. Now, the data from the children's school lives, it's a really interesting study. And if you have any questions about that, you can ask Jennifer Simons and Janine Sloan, who are here. It's ongoing. It started in 2019 with the first wave of data collection in sort of spring, summer 2019, May, July. It was done face-to-face, and children, teachers, and principals were interviewed. There are two cohorts, but we are focusing on cohort B, children who were 8 or 9 years old in 2019. So they're slightly younger than the 2008 birth cohort in the Growing Up in Ireland study. So the study was planned to go on until 2025, and we didn't know that there would be the pandemic. And so the 2020 wave of data collection had to pivot to online data collection rather than face-to-face. And so wave 2 is pretty much the spring 2020 lockdown wave that took place online in May, July 2020. So what's exciting about this to me is that this is one of the earliest waves of data collection that we have that speaks to children's experiences of this sort of transition to remote schooling. It's not a study that was done specifically to study the impact of the pandemic. It was already going on, and we have access to data from early 2020. Now, so what is engagement with remote schooling? There are 5 questions, Likert scale from 1 to 5, and they basically speak to how much children like school, except that the questions were adapted to remote schooling. They're in fact taken from the children's life satisfaction scales. And that they were sometimes used as measures of the school climate, before the pandemic. So now it's sort of a measure of the homeschooling climate, except that children are not really in a classroom with other children. They're at home and perhaps with their parents or the family members nearby. So all of these 5 questions form a highly reliable scale. They also load on one factor. And so we created a factor score. It's continuous. We made it have the mean of 100 and the standard deviation of 10. Now, the paper was originally about socioeconomic status, and we don't actually have a great measure of socioeconomic status because we're using data collected from roughly 10-year-old children. We have the family affluence scale that has been validated in at least in children aged 11, 13, and 15 by the Health Behavior in School-Age Children team, and that study runs across all of the European countries and also North America. So it uses information about how many cars and computers there are in the family and how often they go on family holidays. If you sum it all up, and the more the better, you have this variable from 0 to 7. So if they have no cars, no computers, and never go on family holidays, they have the score of 0 on that. We also have questions about resources for home learning, broadly defined. So what do they use for their actual homeschooling, their homework, whether it's some kind of computer or a laptop, or whether it is in fact a tablet or a smartphone. There are also questions to children about whether they can get help if they're worried about falling behind at school, and also how often their homeschool work is checked. Now, we don't know whether it's necessarily checked by their teachers or the parents, but whether it's checked. We can link up with the data from the pre-COVID wave, and so we had teacher reports of how often that particular child turned up at school without any homework done, whether it was really never or sometimes or always. And then we have a bunch of controls such as gender, language spoken at home, whether it's a lone parent or a couple family. And we also have teacher-reported scores on their emotional and socio-behavioral functioning from the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire, and that will be quite interesting. So in terms of our sample, unfortunately, there is a certain amount of attrition. Not everyone who took part in the first wave agreed to take part in the second wave. Now, at wave 1, there is a nationally representative sample of schools, primary schools in Ireland with roughly 2,000 children. And then by the end of it, our analytic sample is less than 400 children. And it is positively self-selected on socioeconomics. Those who live with both parents have a higher family affluence scale score, speak English at home, always came to school with their homework completed before the pandemic, and have better socio-emotional and behavioral functioning scores, these children are more likely to participate. In the end, we do a school fixed effects regression, even though we don't see very much going on at the level of schools, but just in case. So these are the results. Now, we do not actually see anything going on with the family affluence scale, basically, a zero coefficient. So no evidence that those from somewhat wealthier households in terms of cars, computers, and family holidays are more engaged with their remote schooling. We do see, however, that those who use a computer or a laptop for their schooling are a lot more engaged with it, and those who say that they can always get help if they're worried. So substantively large and statistically significant coefficients there. And also those who have lower hyperactivity and inattention scores, those are more engaged. So the higher your hyperactivity score, the less engaged you're going to be during the pandemic. One of the largest coefficients, of course, is the gender one. So it's consistent with the literature on gender differences in education in primary and secondary schooling, and that is as large as the one on having a computer or a laptop. So this is my last slide. So does it mean that there are no socioeconomic differences in engagement with schooling? Well, no. So first of all, it could well be that the family affluence scale is just a poor measure of family socioeconomic status. It measures some kind of economic well-being dimension, but it's not necessarily socioeconomic status. But also, we do have a pretty privileged subsample that we're looking at. These are households who have internet access that is reliable enough for the children to take part in this web-based survey. And also, these are the families where there is both time and energy to take part in this Wave 2 survey. And so even among this reasonably privileged subsample, we see that having sort of resources for homeschooling is really, really important. So this is where the socioeconomic gradient really is, not in the family affluence scale, but whether the child has a computer or a laptop of their own. And finally, even though it wasn't a primary question that we were asking, but it looks like engaging with remote schooling is not something that is equally easy for all children. And those who find it more difficult to concentrate, those with greater hyperactivity and inattention scores find it a lot harder. And also boys, everything else being equal, find it harder. So I'll stop here. I'll here are the main results, and I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Great, Kat. Many thanks. Indeed, we have 3 minutes for questions.